What's up,
What
buddy?
what up, man? How you doing?
Not too bad.
Nice, nice. So yeah,
Hot as hell here.
what's the temperature at?
Like 96 with like 87% humidity.
Ooh, the humidity.
Oh,
Ooh.
brutal.
Yeah, it's getting pretty hot
Heard
here
it.
too.
I heard it.
You did indeed. You did
So,
indeed.
so quick, just to get a couple chuckles and laughs out of you, that I
Do
was
you
going
have
to
it
do
on?
it.
There it is. There it is. You know that last one's gonna get me triggered.
The troll is high tonight.
Hey man, I respect it. Gotta have some fun with it, right? That's
Hmm?
like Robert. What he usually has some kind of gag or some kind of joke he hits me with. So I know we kind of talked about maybe talking about systemic racism to some extent, possibly.
Hmm.
But I mean, I'm still open, just kind of whatever. We can kind of flow, see what the kind of comments kind of drop in with, and just go from
Oh,
there.
Blind Man Fletcher. See, I lived for quite a while in Denver, Colorado. See, so 97 with 10%. You guys have what's called a dry heat. You don't got to worry about the humidity. See, it's not the heat that'll kill you out here. It's that humidity. It's just oppressive. It's hard to breathe. It sucks. And then doing HVAC and stuff. Like I've moved from the tech side of things. I'm actually on the sales side of things now. And out here, most everybody has their units in the attic. You'll have your air handler or furnace or whatever type of system you have in the attic. And attics get brutal out here. The worst attic that I've been to out here was last year. I was helping with the install, and the highest temperature registered was 163 in the attic. And we had to do 7-minute shifts. You can only be up there for 7 minutes. You couldn't touch anything that was like metal. You burn the shit out of yourself. And we had a stopwatch going, 7-minute shifts, and we ended up having another crew come over to help just because we had to rotate 4 guys to get the job done because we could not do it on our own. It was insane.
Fuck that.
Yeah, humidity is a son of a bitch,
Yeah, nah,
and
160.
doesn't help with humidity either.
So yeah, no, thank you. Yeah, no, 100%. It's hitting that time of year. I mean, you're gonna have a hard time escaping the heat anywhere in this country. So, but yeah, huge difference between 90 to 100 in a dry heat, and even 80 to 90 or 95 with that humidity. So, did you have anything specific you kind of want to jump in tonight, or do you just want to kind of
Let's wing it. That's what we did last time. Let's do it again.
let's do it again? So, I think we did kind of mention systemic racism. I know that's a pretty hot topic these days because to me, I think
Hmm.
it's an easy kind of signal of where someone's frame of mind is going to be at when we're looking at some of these issues. So, do you want me to kind of let you take the stage there, maybe?
I'll let you go first.
Cool. So to me, I will, and this one always gets a lot of pushback. I think a really easy way for me to dive into this these days is just to say denial of systemic racism inevitably leads to a racist pivot or belief, in my opinion. And that's a pretty heavy claim. That's a pretty heavy comment, right? It's like, whoa, hold on a second. So it's not that I think denial of systemic racism in and of itself is racist, right? No, it's just rejection of an idea, right? But I typically find when you flesh that out and when you start to dive into the reasons why one might dismiss the idea of systemic racism, typically I think it highlights racist beliefs. So it's kind of where I'd stop for now. If there's something you kind of want to jump in or address.
Well, the way that I look at it is, if you want to talk about the United States and the very, very flawed history that the United States does have, you go back to the ages of pre-Civil War. If you go back to the 1950s and 60s when we were having you know actual race riots, and we were actually having the hardships of Martin Luther King, and the civil rights acts and stuff of 63, 64, and stuff. At that point in time, when we're talking Jim Crow and everything, absolutely, we did have systemic racism in this country, and we had a promise that we had not lived up to at that point. And I think that in 2021, it's very difficult for anybody to sit there and wholeheartedly believe that a person of any color living in 2021 has it more difficult than a person of color had it in the 50s and 60s. I think at that point, you are asking to, like, if you were to take any African American in this country in 2021 and ask them, would you rather live in America 2021 or America circa 1925? Which one would you pick? You're not going to find a single African American out there who would say they would rather live in 1925. It's just not going to happen. And when you look at this, has always been my basis and philosophy that I've always had. If you can show me a racist act or a racist law or a racist person, I will wholeheartedly stand behind you and fight against that. But to simply scream there must be racism and that's why people don't succeed is an absolute cop-out, because you're giving forth what you claim to be a problem with no suggestion of recognition. And that's typically where I base my argument for that from.
So my quick response to that would be, I mean, fair point, right? Like if we look at the history of like man, uh, humans, the species, the United States of America, we compare today to 1950 U.S. Of course, we're doing better than 70 years ago when there was overt racist laws on the book, right? When there was systematic racism on the books. But that doesn't really address systemic racism. That just says, hey, things are improving, which is a good thing, right? It's a good thing that we're seeing improvement in some of these areas. But improvement in areas doesn't mean that the issue has been solved, and it doesn't mean that it's not happening today. So I think we can point to like discrepancies in loans and home ownership rates, and incarceration rates, especially for things like marijuana, things like that. There's just, I think, a lot of things we can point to that we see discrepancies based upon race that would point to one of two things. Either systemic racism is still playing an issue in outcomes today. Remember, we're talking about this on the population level, right? We're looking at demographics. Either it's kind of causing these still to some degree, or maybe we have to start to ask ourselves if racism's like true, like if it's valid, right? Because if we're seeing all these outcomes, in my opinion, that could be reduced to race, then it's either the system or it's about skin color. And I happen to think it's not skin color because I happen to think I think I'm not racist, right? So I attribute these to systemic issues then. So
So, let me kind of cut in there. So when you start talking about things like, we'll say, the war on drugs, because that always seems to be a big hot button topic that people go to is individuals from that community, whether it be the black community, brown community, lower impoverished inner city community. Those individuals go into prison at a higher rate than let's say white people, right? If you look at the crime bill of '94 that was written, that was pushed by those same exact communities who wanted more policing in their areas. It wasn't pushed by white people saying, I want to get in there. It was pushed by the leadership of the black community in these inner city areas saying, this is a problem. This is completely tearing apart our community. There are significant issues we're seeing. We want this fixed. And they took it all the way up to Congress, and Congress did something about it. Now, I will be the first one to say I believe there was a lot of overreach in how that bill was written. However, and I think you'll agree with me on this one, when is the last time that you said, hey, government, we want you to take some power here, and the government didn't overreach? It's like, when's the last time that happened?
yeah.
So when you look at, and the greatest example for it is crack cocaine. The minimum sentence for 1 gram of crack cocaine, which is primarily an African American drug, is the exact same penalty as to what it is for methamphetamine, which is primarily a white person drug. They hold the exact same standard and the exact same mandatory minimum. The problem is that individuals who are in the African American community typically do tend to have more contact with police. The reason why that is because those areas typically require more policing. And that's not a bad thing either. And I'm not coming at that from the perspective of cops need to overrule
Well,
everything.
let me ask you a question there. Why would that area require more policing? Let's dive into
Because that
that.
so when I it might have come across wrong. So what I mean by that is when you have people in those areas who are impressionable, or you have people who have historically lived in that area because that's the area their family could afford, and they never really got out of that area. They're not involved with drug trafficking. They're not involved with gangs, and they're not involved with all these other things that are very bad in any community. These individuals are typically the ones to call the police to say, hey, this is going on. Hey, there's a guy down on the street corner. Hey, there was a shooting that was near my house recently. They're calling the police more often to try to get those things addressed in their communities. And it's no different in the white community. I live in a very rural area. It's not very often we have police contact out here. However, there are trailers that are about a mile and a half down the road. There are typically county sheriff's officers who will hang out outside the trailers because they know they're going to get a call at some point that day for those trailers. It's no different. Skin color means nothing. It's the culture of that environment. And when we start talking about things such as systemic racism, I will be the first one to say that and this is a odd take that you're probably going to have some opinions of. There is systemic racism in this country. And at this point in time, that systemic racism is driven to further people of color over other individuals, to include white people, Asian people, and other people from higher income areas. Perfect example is affirmative action. In affirmative action, like if you wanted to join law enforcement right now, you have a white man, a white woman, and a black man. Statistically speaking, because there are now caps and quotas that city councils require for these police departments, they cannot take the best qualified candidate. They have to take the most ethnic, racial, and diversity hired candidate for that position because they have a quota they're required to meet. To which that standard then turns out the problem that you're going to have, quote unquote, bad policing in certain areas because you have individuals who are not qualified to be in that position.
So the problem with that is we're pointing to something specific that we think negates the concept of systemic racism as it relates to like jobs, but we know that unemployment disproportionately impacts
There are,
um,
there are
people
more
of
there are more
color.
white there are more white people on food stamps, SNAP, WIC, and other state assisted programs than there are African Americans in this country by a
That's
large.
because there's a lot more white people in this country, though. So of
No,
course,
they large no. African Americans make up 13% of the population. Yes, the amount of white people who are sitting right now on food stamps, WIC, and everything else is almost 60% higher.
do you know how many white people there are in this country compared to black people?
Okay, but how many white people are sitting there in a rural area
No, no, no.
versus?
That's like a serious question because there's like an actual answer to that with numbers,
I
right?
understand. So you're talking 13% of the population. So you're talking somewhere between 35 and 43 million African Americans in this country right now.
Yeah. And then
And,
how
and to
many
sit
white people?
Here's another thing: if we want to sit there and talk about things such as racism with this, then you also have to take into account situations such as Harvard Law, for instance. Harvard Law has a standard where SAT scores and grades do not qualify for individuals who are of color coming from impoverished areas. However, if you are Asian American, who would quote unquote be a brown people, or another set of group that we're hearing all this stuff about for people who are constantly being berated, constantly being assaulted, constantly being having hate crimes happen against them, especially since the whole coronavirus situation happened. If you are Asian American in this country and you come from the exact same environment as a person of color, that Asian American person is held to a higher standard. They're required to meet certain SAT scores, certain grade scores, and other criteria to which the African American student is not required to meet. And that African American student, according to most studies, is 13 times more likely to drop out freshman year from a prestige university such as Harvard or any other Ivy League schools. And that was a statistic taken from the Brookings Institute, simply due to the fact that it wasn't skin color. It was that person, for whatever reason, wasn't qualified enough to go there. Whether it be they just never applied themselves, whether it be they never dictated that their schooling was important enough to learn how to get to that point in their life, but another student did. Simply because of skin color, one student is admitted, one student is omitted. That is a form of racism. Then you have such things as Mayor Lori Lightfoot out in Chicago right now. She just did it. She just spoke to people a couple days ago and said from this point forward, she refuses to do any interview with anybody who is not black or brown. She refuses to do any interview with anybody who has a white skin tone. That's racism. That's open racism. However, that type of narrative is forwarded. That type of narrative is pushed forward, and we're told this is okay. That is a form of racism. Could you imagine if Donald Trump had gone out there for all the stuff that happened with Donald Trump? Could you imagine if he went out there and said, from this point forward, if you are Asian because the coronavirus happened, I will not do an interview with you? Can you imagine the outrage of that?
Like when he tells people of color who are born here to go back to their country?
Nobody said it that was taken out of context.
How
He
so?
said illegal immigrants can go back to their country.
No, when he's talking about the squad, because they're ladies who aren't white. So notice how so when he has things to
Ilhan
say
Omar
about
was
Nancy,
Ilhan Omar is a Somali immigrant,
but
and
the other
Ilhan
three,
Omar
but the other three,
AOC. I mean, she was a bartender. She also sits there and says that she almost died during the January 6th
she
riots,
was a
which she
bartender who was amazing in school. So she had an
um,
amazing educational
what
background. Like she's
I'm saying
very,
is that
very smart. She says some
she's
things I
blatantly,
disagree with,
is
but
blatantly known for lying. She's
like
blatantly
what?
known for hating this country.
Like what?
She claimed that on January 6th that she almost died. She was nowhere near where the riot happened. Not one
She
person.
did because there's a building and there was people in that building who were trying to take out political figures,
She wasn't.
including the vice president.
She wasn't in that building.
So that's actually a really, I think it was Tucker Carlson actually who did that, who tried to throw doubt onto her claim by saying, "Oh, it's not the same building. They're all connected, man. It's built. They're all
It's
connected. They're literally all
it's a
connected.
quarter mile long.
They're about 30 seconds to a minute away from the Senate and from the Congress and from president and
They
stuff
were
like
never
that.
that close.
So
They
dude,
were
so
never
for
that
example, the video, so for the example, the video where you literally have an open door to where government officials are and the cop leads in the opposite way, that's a 10-second divide between them and government officials right there. So that's an easy example of it
but that's
happening.
not her.
Video evidence.
That's also not from
So
her.
yeah, but that's just one easy example of it happen. You just said it didn't happen to anyone because I said it wasn't just her. It's happening to lots of people, and you said it didn't happen at all. And that's one easy
None of
example
them. Okay.
on video of it
At
happening.
what point? At what point did any of those rioters come to the point where they were actually in a position to physically harm any individual in that building who was a member of Congress?
Their presence once they breached the once they breached the line and they were still in the buildings.
So
That's by
then what would be
definition
your
what you just
argument?
asked
So,
for.
so then what would be your argument then to those individuals who have breached into, let's say, federal courthouses in Seattle?
Intent behind what they're doing, obviously. So to your
They
point,
they literally had Molotov cocktails and were trying to burn the building down.
yeah, yeah. So that's obviously a no-go. That's gonna be the same
And
thing
that happened nationwide. And again, to go back to a cultural issue,
nationwide.
the exact same environments that were sitting there being ravaged by these rioters who were having their businesses looted and burned were the exact same people who were putting up Black Lives Matter plywood on their buildings and were black-owned businesses
So there's a
destroyed.
lot of things we got to dive into because there's a lot of things that you're pointing to, like anecdotally and whatnot, and there's some things we can actually look to with the data here that'll kind of back some of this up. So, for example, you're talking about like the anarchy, right? The law and order push from Trump's administration over summer to get votes, kind of the whole law and order theme. So, would you agree that probably the biggest hotspot of all that was Portland?
I would say probably Portland, Seattle, LA, and Minneapolis itself were all very, very close in being hotspots.
So, yeah, so I think it's fair to say that Portland was the one that got the most focus, right? That's the one that actually got a federal presence. That's the one
When
that Chad Wolf
people
directly spoke of.
chop chaz and stuff like that, I would agree.
Yeah, so and I think it's important because we just like jumped across a lot of topics, boom, 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 boom. So let's try and stick to one, because it's hard to kind of address all the all the various things we said there. But so let's stick to this one for now. Within Portland, so to justify their federal presence there by an unconstitutionally, so by the way, Chad Wolf is our acting director of Department of Homeland Security. He shouldn't have been there based upon the Constitution, but that's okay. We'll dismiss that for now. Um, he put out a list to justify their presence there of all the crimes that have been committed by the violent anarchists, right? And you can go look this up for yourself. It's DHS report. It's their memo, the list of the federal crimes committed, right? And if you
Hmm.
look at this, what justifies it to them, it's a list of 200 crimes over about a month, and literally 80% of these say violent anarchists committed graffiti. Violent anarchists committed graffiti. Violent
Okay.
anarchists committed graffiti. Now, 10% of that, about 10% of that, 100% was serious shit. Molotov cocktails, attacking police officers, destruction of federal property to that extent. Yeah, so 10% of that shit was pretty serious. But that's of like 200 incidences. And that's just the same population of about 150 to 200 people have been doing this shit for about a year. They still were doing this thing, even when Joe Biden got arrested, right? It's about a 3 to 4 block area in Portland. I live on the West Coast. I got a lot of friends in Portland. I've actually been there, right? This is a completely overstated narrative. Now, do I think that the mayor there had some really weak rhetoric that kind of emboldened some of this, right? And try to act like the looting, the rioting, the more extreme violent actions weren't what they were. Yeah, 100%. Wheeler's a dumbass. But let's not fall for Trump's kind of law and order rhetoric. Let's
No,
let's
see that
be
that isn't the issue. Here's where the issue really started coming when you start talking about vandalizing, graffiti, and anarchist ways and stuff. That's still a federal building. The
Mhm.
problem was that the mayors and the city council and the governors of all these states were all telling the police officers stand down. It's the same reason why in New York City right now they've lost almost 25% of the force. Seattle has lost almost 37% of their force. Portland has lost almost 38% of their force. Chicago has lost almost 29% of their force. These officers are leaving because they're being told these people are here, these people are going to do what they want. You're going to sit back, you're going to shut the fuck up, and you're going to let them do it. It's the same way that we have a sitting vice president right now who sat there and said anybody who on her Twitter page posted a link to bond out anyone who was arrested during the riots, which they were calling uprisings. She's also been on film quoted saying if Trump gets reelected, these won't stop. They're going to get worse. We want them to get worse because that means that the people are speaking up. They used that opportunity to forward their narrative. That's all it was. And then they sat there and told police, you can't do anything about this. You cannot do your sworn duty to protect the community. There was an 86-year-old woman, a black woman, who had a family owned restaurant just outside of Minneapolis. That business had been in her family since the 1900s, early 1900s, when her father was liberated from being an indentured servant. And that building, she stood outside and was begging and pleading with the rioters and looters not to mess up her building because of how much it meant to her and her family. That's all they had. They beat her with the 2x4 and she almost died.
Mhm.
That is what we're talking about. That narrative was pushed. That narrative was accepted. And then we have people like freaking Chris Cuomo getting out there on CNN nightly saying, and again, quote, at what point are protests meant to be peaceful? Where is it written protests have to be peaceful? That narrative was pushed for an entire year. And then
So that's a fair
January
question.
6th
But
happened.
that's a fair question. Let's ask. But here's the thing, people. Here's the thing. I can't speak to that specific incident, but I'm gonna go ahead and say let's just say it's true. I'm not gonna push back on the claim. But here's the thing. Again, it's why I keep trying to talk about these conversations and kind of help people and say, yo, population data, anecdote. We can forever find individual examples of racism across the races, individual examples of things gone wrong. There's nothing pure or perfect in life.
Mm-hmm.
So we have to talk about the actual data, right? We have to talk about this as objectively as possible and not deflect away from the data. Because
Mm-hmm.
the data is clear. The data is abundantly clear, like abundantly clear. So, for example, let's talk about education. And you can classify this by predominantly white districts, meaning 75% plus white students, predominantly non-white districts, meaning predominantly 75% plus people of color, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we know that, and this is about the same amount of students for each of these districts, by the way. We know that the predominantly white districts got $23 billion more in terms of educational funding because of how we do things in this country. All right. What would we call
How,
that? Because
how much
that
of
is a
that do you?
clear that's a clear cut disproportionate. That's clearly disproportionate, right? And I'm not even saying that's due to intent, but that's just a clearly unfair outcome. Clearly, that's not
Okay,
right. Do we?
so
Do we? Go
okay,
ahead.
here's one thing that needs to be corrected, and this is one thing, and I'm not trying to attack you personally with this, but this is one thing that's a very strong argument on the left, and that is the equality of outcome. This nation was not built on equality of outcome; it was built on equality of opportunity.
Yeah, exactly. That's not fair.
That's
That's
very
the
fair
point.
because that means that me coming from a poor military background, I have just as much of an opportunity to become a CEO of a Fortune 500 company, or to become a congressman, or to become the president, as the poor black guy who lives in the
That's
middle
not
of
true.
central Chicago.
That's
I have
fundamentally not
just
true
as much
based upon the
opportunity from
numbers.
the starting gate to do that. It's my choices and my decisions that dictate how that goes forward.
That's fundamentally false. So first of all, if you look at
So
generational wealth,
how?
I'll
Generational wealth
explain.
means nothing.
Well, that
Ready
actually
for
means
this?
everything because
No, my father-in-law. My father-in-law
my
came
dude,
from a
my dude,
family who
my
immigrated
dude,
here.
before you go into this personal story, what did I say a minute and a half to 2 minutes ago about anecdote versus population level data? What did I say about that?
my father-in-law immigrate. My
Bro,
father-in-law's
you
family
just,
immigrated here from the Middle East.
homie, you just bypassed my question and went right into anecdote. Help me out here. What was my point about anecdote versus
Okay,
population?
give me one example of somebody who has generational wealth, who was able to sit there and
White
just boost
families have
themselves.
$102 trillion in accumulated assets when you put them as a collective. Black families have 6 trillion.
Okay.
That's a staggering difference when we consider that we live in a capitalistic system where money drives everything that we do. So if we
So
look at loans,
what would your solution to that be?
my solution to that would be, for example, the fact that we have loans in this country that help people like buy houses and things, and black people in this country get denied loans at 2 to 3 times more of a rate than white people.
Now,
That's
do you think that has more
wrong.
to do with credit score, debt to income ratio, and other factors such as that, or simply due to the fact that somebody who's a loan officer who has the opportunity to charge interest on a loan to make money for the corporation they work for says, black person, go fuck yourself? Or do you think it has more so to do with, hey, this person has a high debt to income ratio. Hey, this person has a history of not paying
Why
back
do they
debt.
have a
This
high
person
debt
has a
to
bad
income
credit score.
ratio? What's
Why should I
the
give this loan to a
system?
person?
What's this system and country done to them historically? Literally, literally, people who are still alive today lived in a time when there were overt laws on the books to keep them down.
You're
Literally,
right.
still alive today. They existed in that
You're right.
America.
You're right. They did exist in that America, and America is not that place. That America hasn't been that place since the civil.
America's still that place because when how do you know who killed Martin Luther King?
I mean, we're talking conspiracy here. Or are we
No, I'm
talking?
talking real facts. Like we know who killed him. This isn't a conspiracy.
I mean, because there's a lot of reports out there. It was the CIA that was behind it.
FBI, U.S. government killed him. So the
Hmm.
U.S. government killed Martin Luther King, right, in the 1960s. At that point in time, if someone was 15 to 20 years old, they'd be about the age of a lot of our congressmen and congresswomen right now. Okay? And at the time of his death, remember the U.S. government killed him. At the time of Martin Luther King's death, 74% of Americans deeply, deeply disapproved of him. And remember, that same generation, if you're 15 to 20, would be alive today, the same age of all those good old people up in Congress right now. So I think it's naive to act like we've just all of a sudden moved past this when that very generation said, oh, Martin Luther King fixed everything. We're colorblind now. Of course,
No,
that's what they
I,
said.
I,
They killed
okay. So
him.
I would never make that claim. I would never sit there and make the
But
claim that Martin Luther
but let
King.
me pause you real quick, because you just started this conversation by trying to act like systemic racism is a thing, but it impacts white people, not black people, by talking about affirmative
No, I'm
action, things
saying
like
that
that.
was an example of a way that systemic racism still does exist in this country. Okay, then do this. Show me one law in the books right now that is designed to specifically take any person of any color, and systemically hold them down. To
Anything
say
related
you
to
are never
marijuana.
going to come up.
Anything related to marijuana, because we know that people smoke marijuana at about the same rate, 17.8% if you're a black American, 16.5% if you're a white American. But we know that you're 3.64 times more likely if you're a black American to get charged and arrested for possession. So even though we all do
Now,
the same rate, 3.64 times more likely. We know. So here's the thing, man. That's a fucking example right there. We know what the outcome is, and we do nothing about it. So whether it's on purpose or not, we know that happens, and we allow for it. That's fucking racism.
so is it also racist to sit there and say that white people get caught for DUI at an extenuatingly higher rate than African Americans? They
Is that
probably
true?
drink about the same rate. It's very much so true. They actually get
So
stopped
so
and
white
arrested
people
about
get charged.
33%
So
more.
per capita, white people get charged more for DUIs than black people per capita.
If you are a white person, you are about 33% more likely to be arrested on DUI charges than an African American.
I'm gonna go ahead and actually contend that one, but because you're usually pretty good with your numbers, I'm going to just say I'm not gonna call you wrong. I'm just gonna say pin
Mm-hmm.
that one. I want to look that one up. Fair?
Okay.
Because I'm not because your numbers are pretty usually solid. You just got to redirect you, I think, into kind of utilizing a better way
So
of
and
accessing
again,
them.
and look at it like this: the other big thing that everyone has for systemic. Now, if you want to talk about police reform, being systemic and stuff like that, I'm all about certain issues of police reform. When you want to talk about qualified immunity, if you want to talk about police unions, I'm anti-union across the board as it is. But if you want to talk about like how the police unions have, qualified immunity built into certain situations, I'm all about reforming that. But the whole notion that defunding the police, getting rid of the police, is going to solve everything, so it serves no purpose. If we go back to the numbers for the amount of police that have been lost in certain areas, perfect example is Chicago. Chicago has seen this year. Now, mind you, Chicago has always had a lot of shootings. Chicago's always had that issue. They also have some of the strictest gun laws in the country. When you look at Chicago, with the amount of police that they have lost in the city of Chicago, homicides and violent crime on the inner city, not the outskirts and suburbs, the inner city alone is up almost 113% from what it was this same exact time frame last year,
Let
right
me
before George
pause you
Floyd
real quick
happened.
because that's not wrong, but I think we're attributing that to the wrong thing because that's going to be the same kind of number across like states and cities, regardless of whether like costs are dropping or not, because
Correct,
of just the
but
last
here's
year.
what I'm saying.
Okay.
Here's what I'm saying with that is Jen Psaki gave an answer in her press conference yesterday, or I think it was yesterday. She was asked specifically about the crime problem. Do we have a crime problem? Her exact answer and how she said it was no, we have a gun problem. The same amount of guns were there last year. The same amount of guns were there 5 years ago. The same amount of guns were there in the middle of 2020.
Yeah,
The
I
issue
think
is
I'll
we're
say I
lowering the
think the
police
gun thing
presence
is a
because
cop
that's a
out.
narrative being pushed.
The gun thing's a bit of a cop out to me, not because it's not necessarily
Mm-hmm.
true, like it's a variable. Obviously, it's a variable because it makes certain like violent crime just more harsh in the outcome, right? But the reality
Mm-hmm.
is, there's a lot of other things to be talked about, I think, because there's like 300 plus million guns in this country. That's not changing. However you feel about it, that's
Mm-hmm.
not changing. So you might as well if you're trying to find real solutions, look towards actual variables at play that we can do something about. Now, there is something to be said about having a conversation about responsible gun culture. 100%, we got to get better about.
Agreed.
We talked about this. You
Yeah, we
you
did.
kind of went into it. Yeah, you went into it, which I
No,
agreed
and I
with.
agree with you. If we're talking about responsible gun ownership, and you and I both agreed with this. But what I'm saying is that when there's a blatant answer in front of you, to sit there and say no, that blatant answer can't be the reason because we pushed a narrative for so long and we can't back off on that narrative. I have to find another reason as to why this is a problem. I'm going to blame that because I don't like that. That's all it is. And that is the exact same thing with systemic racism at this point in time. When you look at the amount of people who are African American in this country, look at like perfect example for it. Okay, if you want to talk true systemic racism, there are people out there who just want to suppress African Americans and brown people and any other culture but white. Why is it then that the NBA, MLB, and the NFL have such disproportionately high amounts of African Americans and brown people within their ranks, making millions upon millions of dollars, and white people are paying their hard earned money to go watch them play a game on a
Because,
consistent basis?
so,
If
for
these people
example,
hate black people so much, why would we allow that many people of color to reach that platitude to have the voice of a LeBron James?
so it's
Why would we?
conflating a
Now, I
couple
disagree
of
with LeBron
things.
on a lot of things, but I will never sit there and say that man doesn't deserve to be where he is because he has no talent. He deserves to be broke and living in the hood again. I would never say that. I don't know anybody who's white who would say that.
Do you know how much
Explain to
money
me then why
LeBron
it is that
James
we have.
makes? Do you know how much money LeBron James makes the NBA himself?
I actually don't know what his contract
Here or
is.
in
Bro,
China?
bro, he brings in, so because the NBA is well, it's not a hard cap, but they have a salary cap, and then you can go into luxury tax. So
Mm-hmm.
LeBron James brings in about 40 million plus a year, just from his
Mm-hmm.
contract with the NBA, right? Dude, he himself he probably brings in billions for the NBA, man. And I'm not like that's
Oh, he
not an
does.
over projection, right? So we have to think about this again from the standpoint of what are they doing here, entertainment. And well, when things started to shift in America, so after the Civil War, people had to concede space to people of color, right? But they haven't conceded in the decision making. So, okay, sure, we'll concede space in the entertainment arena, but here's the thing. When we talk about systemic racism, an easy way to kind of think about this is range of decisions people can make, all right? And if we live in a country where we kind of force people into certain areas, right, which makes it harder for them to get resources. Then we do certain loaning practices based upon, oh, you're not good with money and stuff. Yeah, but we never allowed you to have money, so of course you're not good with money because like you never have like you just like okay, it's like for example, think of a really easy way of this. Imagine someone's been in prison for like 40 years, and then you just let them out, but you give them fucking nothing. They're gonna be homeless. What do they actually have, right? They can't just go get a job. They have no skill set, right? They don't have anything that's valued within the way this society's been built, right? Because you've taken this person from their culture, their history, their language, their ethnicity, right? Their people, their families, their like all of these things they've been taken from them. Not just taken, but then they were brought here and literally all of this was built with their unpaid labor. All of this, like it was their unpaid labor that built this. right? And then we condemn them for not. But it's like, dude, just to a few generations ago, we like literally were having court cases and having like riots in the street just because they wanted equal rights. Like, you know what I'm saying? And like we still have people from that era alive today. I just think it's crazy to try and deflect this back on, oh, like it happens to everybody. Yeah, of course, because we have a fucked up country. A lot of people get fucked here. White, black, brown, right, indigenous, right? Everybody gets fucked in this country. The problem is just in that fuckery. I think an easy way to kind of get it is within this fuckery, some people get it worse. So like no doubt about it. Like I think you're gonna go into your story either about your dad or something, and dude, like my dad and my mom, they didn't have it easy, right? Like my dad came here with no
Yeah.
English, $25, and he made something of himself. That's the crazy thing about this country, man. You still got to play the hand you're dealt, right? And if you play the hand you're dealt and you get kind of lucky and you make some really good decisions and a few things kind of break your way, it can end up really fucking well for you, right? Really fucking well in this country. But the problem is some people got to play things way better than others, and some people don't even get a chance to play the hand sometimes. They just don't get
And
that
how,
chance. And
when you
so
when
to
you
your
want to
point of,
talk about
so
people who don't get a chance to play that hand, how much of that has to do with the cultural impact around them? When you start talking about MLUs and stuff like that, and these environments that kids grow up in, you show me any child of any color who sits there and grows up in an environment, especially we'll say with African Americans. You show me one African American child who will have the opportunity to truly succeed and truly make something of themselves when they've spent their entire life being told by their community, by the gang members that are around them, to drop out of school because that's the only life they're going to have, by other community members, their own family saying every decision you make will be wrong because there's some shadowy, nameless, faceless person out there who hates you specifically just because of your skin color. It doesn't exist. You show me one person who's able to succeed from that and actually make something of themselves because the more you're beaten down, the more that you are told you are nothing. When you talk about people who have severe depression, severe suicidal tendencies, who truly have drug problems, opioid addictions, alcoholism, these people are people who are damaged mentally because they have been told time and time again, you're a fucking piece of shit. You're a fucking loser. You're never going to fucking be anything, to the point where they finally started fucking believing that. And the second they started believing that is the second that they started fucking doing all the more stupid shit that landed them in the position that they're in at that point in time. When you grow up in that environment, it's damaging. And these people don't understand that. All anybody wants to say is it's the system. It's not the system on a federal level. It's not the system necessarily even on a state level. It's the system within your local community. Because I know black people who have come up in vastly different environments where they came up in a poor society. They did not have all the luxuries of life. They didn't have all these things that rich white people get. But what they did have was a community that was gathering around themselves to try to further each other around them. They didn't have gang members out there. They didn't have drugs slinging all over the place. When somebody sees that growing up and that's all they know, that's all they're going to do.
my problem here is usually you have data for your points. You don't have data for this stuff. I think you're kind of just shooting from the hip, honestly, because I think it's an easy pivot to culture. But again, it's why I preface what you said with we stripped an entire continent of people we brought here of
Here's
culture,
data.
bro. So what?
Here's
So
data.
what? Hold on. So what? Who? So here's the thing. If you're gonna point to their culture, it's our culture. This is our culture.
Here's the data. In the same amount of time that the civil rights movement have apparently made so many strides, single motherhood rate in the black community has risen from 20% to 70%. African
It's
Americans being
risen. It's risen. So the single motherhood rate has risen from like 4% to like 24% between like 60 to 90, and that was like across races. So, again, the thing is like, so let me give an example of this. Like when we talk about systemic racism, we know the numbers on crime. We know when you look at it per capita that for example, if you look at police shootings, right, black men are like 2.5 to 3 times more likely to get shot and killed by the cops, for example, when you look at it per capita, right? When you look at the prison population, despite being 12 to 13% of the population, uh, the black community accounts for like 33% of people in prison, right? That's either one of two things. Either we think that black people are more likely to commit crime because of the skin color they have, or the system fucking makes this happen, man. It's one of those two things. Like
or it could
that's the reality.
or the third option, which is that those African American people are just simply creating, statistically committing more crimes than their white counterparts in the same environment.
You just said so you but that's number two. That's that's conceding that black skin makes people more likely to commit crime than
No,
white skin.
no. That has nothing to do with skin color. That has to do with mental decisions and what you personally want to do. No, nobody
But
sits
why is
there.
there? But you just hit it though. But when you account for everything, when we just look at skin color, the only thing different, that's the difference. It's skin.
No,
It's either the
no,
system.
it's not. It's personal choices.
But
It's
if you
personal
have
choices.
less of a range of personal choices because the system has been designed in
Okay,
that way.
hold on. How do you have less of a personal choice to go rob somebody than me
Oh,
as a white person?
so 100,
How do
dude,
you have less of a personal choice to go
that's a
join a
really
gang?
easy one. If you have a
That's not a,
population,
but that's what they're
it's
being
a super
arrested
easy
for.
one, dude. It's a super easy
We're
one.
not
If
talking about black people being arrested for simple crimes like jaywalking or driving too fast. These people who are in prison are doing things such as murder, felonious assault, assault and battery with a deadly weapon, brandishing a
we were
firearm,
talking about
disorderly
marijuana use at one point, and we got away from that really quick.
marijuana use.
And that's federally done.
We're going back to the war on drugs.
Yeah, because it's a big one because it
And
disproportionately
who
impacts the
wrote the
community to
bill?
millions.
Who
Yeah,
wrote the
because
bill?
it's a great example of systemic racism. So this is the conflation between systematic racism and systemic racism.
Who
I
wrote
don't
the
think
bill?
the crime we can say Joe Biden. I think that's what people are looking for. So here's the thing, dude. This is a great example of just because things aren't done on purpose doesn't mean the outcome's not racist still. That's why systemic racism is a term and systematic racism is a term, right? And that's why when we look at things, loans, home ownership rate, right? Sentencing outcomes, police encounters, use of force, police shootings, death by cops, right? When we look at when we look at your when we look at someone's carbon footprint, right? It's disproportionately white people, and then when we look at outcomes related to like air pollution and shit, it impacts people of color more. Dude, there's so much data when we look at outcomes that makes it fucking clear that this country disproportionately impacts people of color. It's so abundantly clear because we look at, again, I can list all these topics, I can give us all the numbers here. And at some point in time, white America is going to have to acknowledge the history I just laid out about Martin Luther King, about this generation still being alive today, about them being in major positions of power, impacting things, about the whole colorblind lie between 1960 and 2000, right? We're going to have to acknowledge this at some point, my dude. We're going to have to acknowledge these numbers. We're going to have to acknowledge the fact that we're really, every time the numbers come up, everyone wants to jump to individual examples. But that just shows that we're not understanding the conversation. Because
So
it's,
here's my counter argument to this. Okay, when you want to sit there and talk about how situations disproportionately outcome and affect African Americans, those are typically coming from polls. Those are typically coming from studies that are directed to the point where they want to further a certain narrative outcome. If you
no,
were to
these are coming. So everything I'm citing comes from the Bureau of Justice, FBI, Department of Justice. I mean, there's different branches and stuff like
so
that.
then so then
U.S.
explain that.
Census,
So if
Department
you're
of Health and Human Services.
so
So
okay,
no, so
talking
no.
about Federal Bureau of outcomes, and the big one that you pushed on is like police brutality and stuff like that. If you want to look at, we'll take police shootings for example. Okay, the situation in actually perfect example. Did you hear what happened in South Carolina yesterday? There was a black man in South Carolina was a wanted subject in connection to a quadruple homicide that happened. Okay, he led police going 113 miles an hour down the freeway for almost 4.5 hours. Crashed the car, dove out to the woods. Took 200 police officers to find him. He was arrested, not a mark on him. He surrendered when police arrived there and finally caught up with him. Not one thing happened. Now, you look at the shooting that happened while frickin' Chauvin was being charged and convicted, okay, where the woman cop thought she had her taser. Number one, that's a perfect example why you don't need to defund the police. As somebody who's held multiple firearms and multiple tasers, how you could ever confuse the weight of those two, beyond me. I will be the first person to say that she truly does deserve to be convicted of at minimum manslaughter because that was unacceptable. When you look at what happened in South Carolina, that's not being told on the mainstream media right now because it doesn't equate to the narrative that they're trying to push that black people are oppressed in this country.
But my dude, every time you keep giving examples, so we're talking about things that happen at a rate of 330 million people. So when we're talking about disproportionate outcomes, you can find hundreds of thousands of outcomes where this impacts white people. The point is it happens to like millions of black people. That's the point. It's that it's disproportionate. It's not that it doesn't happen to other people. It's that it's disproportionate. It's disproportionately done. And no matter how many anecdotes you can point to, it doesn't matter because what population level data is the accumulation of anecdote. And so, for example, 75% of white people and their social media presence have no fucking minorities whatsoever there. It's a bunch of white people in this country talking about shit they have zero experience of. They just don't know. I'm not saying it's you, but you're in the
Yeah, I know.
25%. You're in the 25% of people who are white who have some kind of interaction with minorities on social media. That's insanity, dude. That's a lot of people talking about shit they just don't know about. You know what I'm saying? And we can't keep so for example, when you gave the response about drunk driving, I'm gonna have to go look into that. That's okay. Let me go look into that, right? Because that's fair. We're
Hmm.
talking about numbers there, right? That's population level shit. But we can't utilize anecdote as a rebuttal to population level data, like data. Like we just can't, like because it's not. Because I'm talking about the accumulation of those anecdotes. So we'd
So
have to.
again,
The rebuttal
so
would be
so
to your.
what
So
would
for
be
example,
what would be your solution? What would be your solution right now, day one? Youth and Media just got elected as president. How would you correct the situation?
I would change our education system so that we're actually taught the real history of this country.
So are we talking 1619 project?
I'm talking so that we understand that manifest destiny is not a real thing. It's taught it's taught critically, it's taught correct that this was a bullshit concept originally that some people utilized to do some pretty heinous things. But we also don't hide away from the fact that this country's done some pretty crazy things, man. You don't have to like we can point out the flaws of the founding father and recognize the greatness of taking on the British Empire, right? That's
So
that's
if we want to
insanity.
talk, okay, so pause real quick. We're talking about you want to talk about flaws of the founding fathers. Do you know what happened when Thomas Jefferson wrote the Constitution originally?
That's a big question. Go ahead and dive into it.
So when he wrote the Constitution and took it to the Congressional Congress to be approved, there was over 278 references condemning and damning those who were a part of slavery. It needed to end at that point. And this is Thomas Jefferson, who was a slave owner at that point in time. Absolutely said, if we're going to do this, we need to do it for everybody. All the southern colonies threatened a revolt and automatic civil war if any of the rhetoric stood, simply due to the fact that they would lose their agricultural income because that's how they made their income. Now,
Mm-hmm.
that stood forward. What I'm saying is that this issue was brought up back then. This issue was pushed back then. This narrative that it needed to stop was pushed back then. But what ended up happening is it was kicked down the road to another day, and it was a very bad day when the Civil War started. I'll be the
Exactly.
first one to
Slavery was
sit there
written.
and say that
Exactly. Slavery was written into our Constitution. Exactly. Like that's
this
part of the problem,
this country
right
has
there.
this country has had many black eyes, and I will be the first one to admit that slavery is one of the biggest black eyes this country has ever endured. And you can throw the internment of the Japanese during World War II into this. You can throw indentured servitude. You can throw Jim Crow into this. There's been many, many severe black eyes upon this country. But to sit there and suggest that in 2021, that the issues of things that happened over 80 years ago at minimum, we'll say 50 years because that's when we really had the civil rights movement. To sit there and suggest that somebody who was born in the mid 90s is suffering because of something that happened 30 years plus before they were born is unacceptable. Because in this day and age, if you have a teenager coming up in today's day and age, they're not oppressed. These
Dude,
individuals who are coming up, regardless of skin color, are not told
that's
you can't come into this establishment
what you just
because you're
said's fundamentally
this.
not true though. For example, like things that happened 2000 years ago impact us today. So for example, like the split of the Roman Empire impacts us today because the split of the Roman Empire completely dictates why the Western world to some extent does what it does, right? In a more individualistic kind of fashion, and why the collective, the eastern part of the world does things, like I just said, in a more collective fashion, right? Because the split of the Roman Empire, to make it really general, you see kind of the split between the more orthodox takes on religion, right? And the kind of more individualized kind of journey, which then gets even broken down more when you follow up with the Protestant, the Reformation, right? Martin Luther. Was that
Real quick,
1590s,
on,
I
on
think?
on a side note, just to kind of lighten the mood,
Oh, you're good.
I
Yeah, what's
was
up?
not joking. Can you see the sweat beating down my head right now?
Oh
It
yeah,
is
it's hot
hot,
as
humid
fuck.
as shit out here.
I believe you, my dude. No, 100%.
But no,
It's hot as fuck.
and no, and I'll be the first one to say, maybe I worded it wrong. Those are cultural impacts that, yes, you know, they will have some effect to somebody. But what I'm saying is that if you take somebody who was born in the mid 90s up through today, or even back when I was born in the 80s, there was not one situation. Like, I grew up in very impoverished areas, whether it was living on a Marine Corps base, which, military does not get paid for jack shit. I grew up in hood areas. Where I lived in Colorado was called Saudi Aurora because it was very minority driven. The public education system was very poor. A lot of gangs, a lot of drug activity. It was not known for being a very good area. I saw these cultural situations around me, and I had issues coping with them because where I came from in my background, in the military, you're green. You're dark green, you're light green, you're green. Everyone is green. You all learn, love the glasses. You all learn to respect each other. You all learn, regardless of skin color, that is another human being. It was a culture shock to me to go to an environment where when I walked in, people treated each other differently based upon their skin tone. And I made it an objective of mine to become friends with everyone. I had black people walking up calling me the Oreo. I had black people walking up calling me, what's up, my N-word? Consistently. And at that point in time, to me, it was, this is just cool. I got friends from all over the place. I got friends again. But looking back on it now, that's a degrading environment for anybody. When you sit there and have an environment where you grow up with the gangs around you, when you grow up with, people doing drugs, behind the school on a Sunday afternoon, when you don't have a strong, regardless of what religious preference you have, if you don't grow up in a strong religious community, if you don't grow up in a community that supports each other, those are very difficult circumstances for anybody to get out of, regardless of whatever skin color it is.
Hmm.
And I want to understand how it is that somebody who grew up in rural Appalachia in West Virginia, who grew up in a trailer park with meth heads all throughout their family, has a better chance to succeed than the person who grew up in South Central in a gangbanger environment where people are slinging crack on the corner. It's the same fight, just a different environment. And the thing is that people sit there and say it's the skin color that dictates it, not the environment that they grew up in.
In some ways, it is the same fight. In some ways, because the systemic inequalities in this country, if you look back at the history, so American slavery was kind of a unique process, a unique endeavor when you look at what slavery typically looked like in the history of the world, right? And so part of the issue here is we're pointing to. I'm not gonna lie, I have a heart. There's a lot of things I want to address. I don't fucking have enough time. Because I got 7 minutes. The biggest thing we need to address is when indentured servants were getting sick of the game in the early colonies, we didn't have enough labor. And they realized that, and the easiest way to have labor was to okay, if we can't get labor for indentured servitudes, right, they're starting to kind of push back. Who's the most vulnerable group? And it was easy to kind of split people up based upon skin color. And that's what they did. They made a shift. And so all of a sudden, so at that point in time, anyone could be in indentured servitude, right? White, black, indigenous, it didn't matter. And you also had free black people, even some, I don't think really natives, honestly. Oh no, you're good peoples. We're gonna get it going, dude. Shit. So yeah, how about that? We'll just continue this conversation. In the next one, I think. Yeah, cool. Do you want to? How about this? I'll give you the kind of the last. You want to close, and I'll close, and then we'll.
Yeah.
Cool.
Regardless of where you and I stand politically in this conversation and argument, God, I'm sweating like a stuck whore in a big church. I absolutely love our conversations. I know this is the first one that we've had that actually kind of got a little heated. I really enjoyed it.
But, yeah, 100%.
I love having the back and forth with you, and honestly, this is one of the best things that I found on TikTok as far as being able to come together and come from completely different perspectives. But at the end of the day, I still consider you cool. I still love you to death. But I like your posts and everything. I'll still talk to you like a buddy on the outside,
Hmm.
and I really think that a lot of people take too much heart in people's political views and not enough into who the actual person is. And I really think that if you and I are able to continue this, hopefully more people will be able to sit there and say, hey, here's two guys that come from completely different perspectives, but at the same time, they're still really cool with each other on the outside.
100%. I'll second most of that definitely because I know I enjoy these conversations. I especially enjoy when it can get a little more contentious, but you know, in the end, it's all good because to your point, we kind of understand the intent behind it all, right? It's not about the people, not about me or you ultimately, right? So 100%, we'll do this again because this is 2 times me and you've done it now, and it's been I think more productive than some of the other conversations I've had. So appreciate everyone's time. Appreciate everyone being here. Appreciate everyone keeping it pretty respectful. We'll definitely continue this conversation probably sometime within the next week or same time next week or something like that.
Next week
Um,
might be weird. We're going out of
eh,
town actually for my birthday's on Thursday, and then we're
hey,
heading out of
bro,
town for
priorities, homie. Jesus Christ. The
now we're
fuck?
taking the fam out of state for Memorial Day weekend, so I'll just be getting back to work, and it's going to be an absolute shit show. So we'll kind of see what the
You're good.
schedule
Yeah, we'll figure
pertains to.
something out.
But worst case, maybe next weekend or something.
Cool. All right, man. Well, hey, enjoy your birthday. Appreciate you jumping on and have a good one, man. I'll shoot you a message when I post it to YouTube. So
Sounds good, bud.
cool. Later, man. Alrighty. So.